Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are beginning our video conference on the outcomes of the referendum on Britain's EU membership. Yesterday, this referendum was held and the country voted to leave the EU. What influenced this vote, and how will the relations between Great Britain and the EU develop after this referendum, and how will it change policy within the EU? And we have our experts here with us today in Moscow and in London who will answer these questions. I would like to start with our Moscow experts, Mr. Maxim Grigoriev. He's member of the Civic Chamber of the Russian Federation and director of the Foundation for Democracy Studies, and Mr. Nikolai Topornin. He's associate professor at the Department of the European Law at MGIMO University. In London, we have with us editor and publisher of Politics First magazine, Marcus Papadopoulos, and senior advisor with Enterprise Europe Network, Greater London Enterprise, Chris Farmakis. He's a little bit late, but he'll join us a little bit later. And I think that we should start with our London expert, where it all actually happened. Mr. Papadopoulos, please go ahead. You can answer these questions that I've highlighted.
Britain has voted to leave the EU. The British public haven't voted decisively to leave, but nonetheless, they have voted to leave. This is that was a decision which will have massive ramifications, both politically and economically, not just for Britain, but for the world. And now it's down to the UK civil service to begin the process of taking Britain away from the EU. There's misconceptions that British politicians will be responsible for the process of bringing the UK out of the EU. That's not true. It's the UK civil service. Ever since David Cameron promised the referendum nearly 3 years ago, the UK civil service has been preparing for this possible eventuality. So the UK civil service are going to be very busy from now on. And what we can say today is that Britain's economic future is uncertain. However, its political future, I can say, is quite certain, because Scotland voted overwhelmingly to stay within the EU. The Scottish government, which is of course led by the Scottish National Party, Nicola Sturgeon, will call for another independence referendum, which they will get, and this time Scotland will vote undoubtedly to become an independent country. And so today the EU's borders have changed, but also Britain's borders will also change, because Scotland will leave. There's also talk that Northern Ireland, which is a very poor part of Britain, and also voted to stay in the EU, there is talk that Northern Ireland could be looking to establish closer political and economic relations with the Republic of Ireland. So today is a turning point in British history. And as I said, the economic future is uncertain, but the political future for Britain is pretty clear. That in time, the map of Britain will look very different to how it is today.
Thank you so much, Mr. Papadopoulos. Mr. Grigoriev, you've arrived from Britain just a few hours ago, so please share your impressions. Yes, we were observers at the referendum. We looked at this referendum through the eyes of our compatriots. According to British law, international observers or citizens of other countries cannot really be present at the polling stations, and we had no right to take any photos at the polling stations. The same provisions exist in Russian laws, so we operated through our Russian compatriots. I had a lot of meetings with many experts on the British side. We looked at what is going on there. So just a few words about the procedure of the referendum, and we had a lot of concerns regarding procedural matters, but fortunately these concerns did not materialize. First is a procedure of voting by proxy, when a voter can choose a person who will cast the ballot for him or her. In Russia, this if we had such a provision in Russia, this would have caused a lot of concerns and critiques, because this would have implied that there is a lot of space for manipulations. Another concern is voting by mail. This is also an impossible option for Russia. But despite our concerns, and to the honor of the British government, this possible way to influence the outcome of the referendum was not used, and the vote was very transparent and clear. We were also very surprised by the administrative pressure, this is how we call it in Russia. During the vote, we usually believe that there are two sides and the government should be neutral. And I'm not talking about the government as a specific person, but as an institution, and that the government does not prevent any of the sides from campaigning. But the government actually acted as a third group. The first group is for the EU membership. The second is against, both get financing from the budget. And the government acted as a third group, actually. And we were very surprised that the British taxpayers paid for a material that was circulated among the voters. £9 million were spent on it to inform the voters of the call of the government on the voters to stay in the EU. And we were also surprised by the fear campaign, the fear-mongering campaign, when most of the government members tried to make the voters afraid, like Mr. Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, that he said, for example, that taxes would go up and life would be much harder if Britain votes against EU membership. So let me just show you this article when Mr. Osborne says that leaving the EU would lead to 440,000 jobs lost, GDP will lose 5%, and so on and so forth. And many forecasts were made using government assessment and projections of the government until 2030. So there was a lot of controversy in British newspapers because these predictions are rarely accurate, especially when it comes to forecasts until 2030. So there was this fear campaign, and we were very concerned with this. But overall, we must say that these opportunities for manipulating the result were not used, and the vote was very transparent. As for the political and the economic environment, in the midterm, I do not see any major issues for Great Britain. I think that, of course, there will be a period of uncertainty and turbulence. Of course, it will have negative implications, but this will be short-lived, and quite quickly, major corporations and all the others will be able to build new relations with the EU, so they will still be interested in trading with the EU, and the EU we are still interested in trading with Great Britain. Car companies already came up with a statement that nobody wants to remove and close down the plants in Great Britain. So in the midterm, probably Britain will win from more favorable trade agreements with the United States, with China, and other countries. As for political issues, domestically within Great Britain, it is clear, everything is clear. Cameron has said that he will resign, although he promised not to do so on a number of occasions. But political traditions in Great Britain are quite strict, and he, of course, came under major pressure from within his own party and from the public. So, of course, who will become the next prime minister is unclear. Of course, Boris Johnson is a very likely candidate, and he was the main and the most active proponent of the Leave campaign, and he has become very popular in this respect. But who will become the prime minister is often decided on the back stage, so it remains to be seen. And most importantly is that it will have huge consequences for the US. This is a major blow for the European Union in ideological terms. Until recently, the European Union and most politicians from EU countries portrayed EU as such kind of a paradise, as an end of history, that everything is becoming better and better, that not all countries are able to join, but those who can will most surely benefit, and the situation within the EU was said to become better and better. But now what we see is something very different, and what English newspapers and politicians wrote and said, that the EU is not a democratic institution, it's unaccountable to anyone, it's corrupt and ineffective, and I quote all of these statements. So I think this definition is quite fair and just with respect to the EU, and the fact that the Great Britain is going to leave the EU will, of course, serve as an impetus for political parties that promote an alternative and are not responsible for their country entering the EU. For example, in France, the National Front Party will actively use this British referendum as a talking point. And to conclude my opening statement, I would like to say that in many occasions, some countries opposed various types of EU legislations, and most often they had to disregard the opinion of their citizens. For example, in the case of the Constitution, the EU Constitution, they've just changed the name. They called it a treaty and not a constitution, and they did not pay attention to the fact that people were against it. But now all those forces will become stronger in the countries. I do not expect the EU to implode in the near future, to become smaller. I think that Great Britain, thanks to its economy and its weight, international weight, is a unique country. Other countries like the Baltic states, they cannot afford to leave the EU or even to oppose anything, oppose Germany or other countries. So I do not expect any major processes, any instant consequences of this referendum. But in any case, the EU has suffered a major blow, and Eurosceptics will become much more active in the near future. Thank you. And Mr. Topornin, please, could you share your perspective on this referendum, and what will be the consequences for the Great Britain and the EU? Well, maybe we'll ask Marcus a question. I know him. If you allow me, I would like to ask him a very simple question. Marcus, could you please share your personal impressions and sentiment before the referendum? What did you expect given the environment ahead of the election? Did you expect this outcome, or this came as a surprise for you?
No, I said at the outset of the referendum that I believed that England would vote to take the UK out of the EU. I said that Scotland would vote to remain in the EU, that Northern Ireland would vote to remain in the EU, and Wales, like England, would vote to leave. So for me, there's no surprises whatsoever. I would add on to that we didn't have a proper referendum in Britain. There was no intelligent discussion about the economics of Britain's membership of the EU. There was no intelligent discussion about the world we live in today, how, whether you like it or not, how all the economies of the world are interconnected with each other. So we didn't have that sort of discussion. What we did have was members of the Conservative Party, in particular right-wing Conservative Party politicians, right-wing journalists and other commentators in Britain, simply inciting nationalism, inciting jingoism. There were constant references to how Britain beat Napoleon, how Britain won World War I, how Britain won World War II, and therefore Britain would never submit to Brussels. That was the sort of discussion that we had. It was absolutely ridiculous. It was an extremely low quality discussion, and therefore the British public in general were never really going to be able to make an intelligent, well-informed decision. Now, I have many, many issues with the EU. I remember how the EU played a role in breaking up the old Yugoslavia, in supporting the bombing of Serbia, placing sanctions on Russia, supporting intervention in Libya and Syria. So I'm no particular friend of the EU, but as a British citizen, I wanted there to be a serious discussion, and that never happened whatsoever. What we had was internal Conservative Party divisions and rivalries being played out in the context of the EU. That was largely speaking, that was the focus of the referendum debate, and that was a disgrace. And you know something? This referendum debate, which was a farce, and let's say it as it was a farce, has cost the British taxpayer £50 million. £50 million to hold a discussion which was in effect about nationalism, about jingoism, and about internal Conservative Party divisions. So no, I wasn't surprised by the outcome. And as I said earlier, this is just the beginning. As the other guest said, there are going to be turbulent times for Britain ahead. Britain, of course, has a strong economy, but politically, things are very, very different looking for Britain in the future. And I will just pick up on one more point that the other guest said when he spoke about the EU and how democratic it is. Well, he's absolutely right. There's a lot of undemocratic ways about the EU. There's a lot of unaccountability in the EU. But please don't forget that if we talk about Britain and democracy, Britain has a head of state, the Queen, who's never been elected. Britain's upper house of Parliament, the House of Lords, is appointed. No one has elected them. So if we're going to, during the referendum debate, if we're going to talk about how undemocratic the EU is, then we really should have looked at our own political system in the UK, because if we had done so, we would have seen that Britain is not this democratic country that our politicians project to the world.
Конечно. Микрофон.
Can I please respond to what you said? I would just like to protect in a way British democracy. While the European bureaucrats who are not elected, they influence major economic and political issues. The British Queen, we cannot say that she has a major political influence. She is more of a symbolic figure in the political landscape. As for the debate in generally, it was said, you were very right to say that there were no good arguments, there was no good debate during the campaign, but the Cameron government is to blame for it, I think, since the Stay campaign was such demagogic, and there was so much talk about values, about general philosophical notions, and there was we missed so much such substantial debates. For example, Cameron said that the EU will be reformed if Britain stays, although everyone understands that it is impossible. Even the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, said that there will be no changes after the referendum. So these demagogic statements came mostly from the Cameron government, but since there was no serious debate, both sides are to blame. So I have a question for you. Who do you expect to become the next Prime Minister? What are the candidates? And how will the government act in the future? So I'm eager to hear your forecast.
The candidates are as follows: Boris Johnson, the former Mayor of London, George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Michael Gove, the Justice Secretary, and Theresa May, the Home Secretary. However, I think it's fair to say, I think it's a fair bet that George Osborne will no longer be a credible candidate, because, of course, he threw his weight behind the Remain in Europe campaign, and I think he has been tarnished in the view of many Conservative MPs and many of the grassroots of the Conservative Party. So, in effect, that leaves Boris Johnson, Michael Gove and Theresa May. Now, Theresa May supported Britain remaining in the EU. Michael Gove, Boris Johnson, of course, supported Britain leaving the EU. So I think they're probably the candidates we're going to be looking at. One of them will be the leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister of Britain this October. But then there's a problem with that, because I think we can say Boris Johnson is probably the front runner at the moment. Of course, things have changed, but at the moment he's the front runner. But let's just look at Boris Johnson and let's compare him to previous British Prime Ministers. If we just put politics aside, party politics to the side, Britain in the last 70 odd years has produced prime ministers of real international standing, real statesmen, real intelligence. Winston Churchill, Harold Macmillan, Harold Wilson, Margaret Thatcher, Clement Attlee, David Lloyd George. As I say, politics aside, they were real, strong, intelligent, serious prime ministers. Boris Johnson is more of a Donald Trump. He's populist. He doesn't have that sort of serious nature that's required to be Prime Minister. And he just portrays himself to the young people in Britain as being, quote, funky, as being, quote, cool. Now, that's not what politics is about. Politics is serious. It's black and white. You've got to have a serious person, an informed person, an intelligent person, a strong person leading the country, someone that will be respected abroad. And quite frankly speaking, Boris Johnson does not tick any of those boxes whatsoever. And I think that demonstrates how Britain has become more and more like America, whereby they vote, whereby a lot of British people, in particular English people, they vote on the basis of the image of a politician, how they speak on television, how cool they are, how funky they are, but they don't look at the depth of a politician anymore. They don't look to the intelligence levels. They don't look to that person's experience of ordinary day life anymore. So I would say Boris Johnson, without a doubt, is the front runner, though it could change. And should he become Prime Minister, I would say that it would be an utter embarrassment and humiliation for Britain, given how Britain has produced such strong Prime Ministers in the 20th century.
Спасибо.
Thank you so much, Mr. Topornin. So, your perspective on the referendum, please, and how come that Great Britain will now leave the EU? They had the first vote in 1975, as we all know. So, your perspective on this issue? Well, you were right to say that the first referendum on Britain's status within Europe took place in 1975, and back then the proponents of the EU won by a slim margin. But now we had the second referendum, and again with a slim margin, although a little bit bigger, the Eurosceptics had the upper hand. What I can say, honestly, most experts, both in Europe, within the EU, and maybe even in Great Britain, I'm talking about experts I know, including Russian experts, most of them, even myself included, we all thought that the Remain campaign will win by a slim margin, and we predicted 52% for staying in the EU. But what happened was the opposite. Those who supported the Brexit won, and now we feel that we are in a new political reality. What I can say is that nothing extraordinary happened, actually. We didn't see any global world revolution, because within the EU, and I would like to focus on the EU perspective, nothing happened, nothing major happened. There was a lot of talk recently that since Great Britain has such different views with the EU, since Britain sees in a different way a lot of things, processes and initiatives than the EU, maybe they should go their own way. And look what happened in the last 43 years. From the very beginning, Great Britain said that it does not want to have a single currency. We know that the Schengen process started in 1985, and Britain said that they do not want to be part of this initiative, and Britain has not joined the Schengen agreement, and it actually wanted to limit this zone and did not want Bulgaria or Romania to be a part of the Schengen zone. Recent political developments, the migrant crisis, for example, what did it show? Britain also has a different perspective on this issue compared to the EU with respect to the refugees and to the labor migrants, including migrants from within the EU, not from third countries, not from Ukraine or Russia or the Arab countries, but from EU member countries who, due to the Lisbon Treaty, have the right to employment on EU territory. Over 2 million migrants of this kind came to Great Britain from Poland, from Romania, from the Czech Republic, from Slovakia, from the Baltic countries. And Cameron said that this is a matter of major concern for us, because it pressures our social infrastructure, our tax system, and we do not intend to pay for this comfortable stay of labor migrants in our country. And the same goes, and so Brussels and London, they parted ways on this issue. The other issue is privileges that Cameron wanted to negotiate for England at the EU summit, and David Cameron, he negotiated 4 privileges at the recent EU summit. The most important of them all was about the migrant policy and the entry to Great Britain. The other aspect were social benefits. So this all took place, but it was already obvious. Just like with Greece, I think that the EU was not right, and other experts may not agree, but I fully support what the finance minister of Germany said. He said, if Greece does not want to abide by the fiscal rules and the monetary policy of the EU. If Greece does not want to comply with the ECB recommendations and is all the time in debt and does not have its budget policy right, maybe it should do this outside the EU. But the situation moved the other direction in Greece. The current prime minister was elected by criticizing the EU policies, but when he became prime minister, what he did, he understood that without the help of the EU and the IMF, we'll never be able to pay back its debt. And he even started flirting with Russia. He came to Moscow several times. He talked to President Putin, and he played on these sanctions. He hinted that Greece may not support sanctions. What he wanted in return, he wanted loans and money. But he probably understood that money from Russia would not be enough, so he turned to the EU and started working more actively with Europe. The current debt of Greece is 320 billion euros, and without the help of the ECB, it will never survive. Cyprus held a referendum in July of last year. It was the question was really ambiguous. It was not as straightforward as in Britain whether you want to stay or leave the EU. In Greece, the question was about the austerity regime and about keeping the euro in the country, and 2/3 of the voters said that they want to stay in the EU and they want to keep using the euro. But this was an exceptional case. They did not have a consensus. Even Cameron had his own point of view on Greece, and it was decided to to keep up this solidarity. But Great Britain is much a bigger country. It's much more independent. It has a very powerful economy. It has strategic nuclear weapons. We should not be mindful of this as well. So my feeling is, although Merkel and François Hollande publicly said that they're interested in Britain staying within the EU, as a matter of fact, they probably are happy that this issue has been solved by itself without involvement from Brussels. Now Britain has decided to leave, and now Paris and Berlin and maybe with the help of Rome as the third capital will now be able to fully determine and oversee the key issues related to the EU. This is my first point. And I understand that we have limited time. I wanted to highlight another issues. There is an important aspect for the Russian Federation. London opens a new niche in the political environment. We had this triangle, Berlin, Paris, London. London goes out. Now we have Rome, Berlin, Paris, and then Warsaw and Moscow if we move east. Now I have a feeling, maybe this is a kind of futuristic, maybe it's just a fantasy, but I have a feeling that Moscow and the Russian Federation, if it has a clear diplomatic line, if it understands what it can and what it needs, Moscow can step into this niche. The Russian president always said that he wants a single economic state from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Maybe some would say that this is an utopia and this is never will happen, but in terms of sanctions as well, Russia also gets an opportunity of some kind, because everyone knows that London and Cameron specifically were the key supporters and very vehement supporters of sanctions. He lobbied for the sanctions, but now since Britain is about to leave the EU, they will not have a political voice under the Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. So now they will not be able to influence EU decisions. They will have an advisory role within the EU, but they will not be able to influence decisions. But Russia has a better chance to see the lifting of the sanctions. I'm not saying that it will happen, but we already see that Italy decided to think about renewing the sanctions. In France, there is this parliamentary reserve procedure when the government is turning to the parliament and consulting on the issue of sanctions. So this all creates new political opportunities, not only within the EU in terms of the powers, centers of power, but Russia could also benefit from this referendum to its advantage. Mr. Toporn, Mr. Grigoriev, in your opinion, what could be the political consequences for Russia of this referendum? I think that in terms of Russia-Great Britain relations, little will change. Great Britain, judging by the official rhetoric, is quite opposed to Russia. What I can predict potentially is that economic relations could improve, or the new government could be more pragmatic with respect to Russia. But this will still be in a closed format, not official, not public. I do not think that in terms of the public statements, the anti-Russian sentiment in Great Britain would enable the new government to be more pragmatic, especially given the influence of the United States in Great Britain. So even if we see any changes, they will be minor. Mr. Papadopoulos, do you have something to add on the issues that our Moscow expert discussed?
I agree on a number of points that both of your experts in Moscow said. In regard to how France and Germany will respond to Britain leaving the EU, well, of course, publicly, they have both, Berlin and Paris have both said that they didn't want Britain to leave. I think in reality, the EU will suffer economically, no question about it, though Britain will as well. But I think at the same time, a lot of people in the corridors of power in Berlin and Paris will be happy to see Britain go. Why will they be happy to see Britain go? Because Britain has been viewed by a number of countries in the EU, when it was the European Economic Community, when it was the European Community, and now it's the European Union, as a troublemaker, and also as America's main eyes and ears in the EU. It's no secret that consecutive British governments, whether Conservative or Labour, would often report back to Washington on what was being discussed in the EU, what the mindset of German politicians was, and French politicians. So I think Berlin and Paris, to an extent, will be happy to see Britain go. And in regard to Britain's relationship with the Russian Federation, nothing is going to change. Why? Because historically, Britain has a very, very hostile attitude and mindset towards Russia. Britain, together with America, lead the anti-Russian crusade in the world. And that's not going to change. And as one of your guests said, Germany was hesitant about the EU placing sanctions on Russia, but it was the pressure from America and also Britain that put the Germans in a situation whereby they had to go along with sanctions against Russia. So now Britain is going to withdraw from the EU. It's extremely likely that Britain will place its own sanctions on Russia, and there should be no one in Russia under the illusion that Britain could become slightly more open-minded, slightly more favourable towards Russia. Not at all. Many of the people in the Leave camp in Britain, politicians, commentators, are very, very right-wing, are very nationalistic, are very pro-American, and therefore they're very anti-Russian. Many in the Leave camp regard America as Britain's really its only true friend and ally in the world, as a kindred spirit. And I think that on the basis of that, Britain will maintain its hostile attitude towards Russia. And I think going forward, there's the possibility that relations between the Russian Federation and the European Union could, and I emphasize could, just slightly improve, which of course will be a good thing, because Russia does have good relations with Germany, France and Italy. Of course, it's not going to be a complete change, because the European Union is a strategic ally of the United States, and the United States has a lot of influence in the European Union through principally Germany. But nonetheless, with Britain taken out of the equation, there's just a small window of opportunity for a slightly better relationship between the Russian Federation and the European Union.
Спасибо.
Thank you so much, dear guests. Let's now move on to Q&A. We have here journalists and experts in the audience. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand. We have a question from the first row, please. Alexander Skvartsov, Big Moscow newspaper. My question is the following. I would like to hear our experts both in Moscow and London on the following question. Since we have this transition period, what are the next steps for Great Britain will take to leave the EU? Are we talking about signing specific agreements? What will be the specific initiatives for Great Britain? This question is mainly to London.
One of the first acts, of course, will be for the British government to oversee its estimated 25 pieces of new legislation, 25 new laws every year, perhaps for the next 10 years. Because, of course, British law has become integrated with EU law, and that has been the case for at least 2 decades. So that's going to be one of the first steps that a Brexit government, if we can call it that, a Brexit government will have to consider, will have to implement, and will have to oversee. Britain is not simply going to have. Britain will not just be able to walk away from the EU. It's not as simple as that, because, as I said, they're legally entangled, they're politically entangled, they're economically entangled, and many objective economists in Britain have said that the whole process could take up to 10 years. But as I said at the beginning of my answer, 25 new pieces of legislation every year for the next 10 years. That's how much time this is going to take. This is how massive the British public's decision is. And of course, a divorce, let's call it a divorce between Britain and the European Union, for it to take up to 10 years, that's only going to create economic uncertainty in the minds of foreign investors in Britain. And that is why I said at the beginning of this debate, and I say it again now, the economic future for Britain is very, very uncertain.
Вы добавите?
Do our Moscow experts have something to add? Yes, I would like to share a legal perspective. During its EU membership that was 43 years, they had many bilateral and multilateral agreements, not only within the EU but also with third countries. And British lawyers calculated how the volume. It is 80,000 pages of legal text. I can even imagine the number of volumes it takes. So this is a huge amount of legal work that is needed. Before any procedures get underway, it is very important what will be the strategy for both Brussels and for London. What do I mean? We know that there are several scenarios for working with the EU. If there is a political decision to leave the EU by Great Britain, it does not mean that all the economic ties will stop tomorrow. This is just runs counter to common sense. There's about 5 scenarios how the interaction with the EU can develop. The key scenarios are the Norwegian scenario, the Swiss scenario, and the Turkish scenario. They are different in terms of the integration depth. The Turkish scenario is the most limited one. All it has is a free trade area. Swiss and Norway went further. They are part of the Schengen zone. And they have agreements on free trade, on various tax and tariffs on the movement of people, labor, and capital. So they all have these arrangements. So it's very important what will be the position and the policy of London in this respect, this Brexit government, as Marcus has said. And what will be the policy of Brussels is also important. All EU leaders and officials, Jean-Claude Juncker and Merkel and François Hollande, the president of France, they all say that we want to continue working with Great Britain, even if it's not part of the EU. It's still part of our large European family, but they can actually think at the same time the opposite. On the British territory, there are over 3 million foreigners that work there from continental Europe. 2 million people, 2.5 million, maybe Marcus has the better number, work in Europe. So we're talking about major companies. London City accounts for 60% of the financial power of the EU. So the economic ties are really intertwined, so you can't just cut them instantly. So both Brussels and London will have to determine a strategy along which they will move when they have consultation. The procedures for leaving the EU are quite simple. You have the European Parliament and the EU Council, and the European Commission also has a certain role. It starts with an official petition by the British government to inform the EU Council that referendum was called, and under the Lisbon Treaty and its Article 50, they start this exit procedure, and then they have 2 years for consultations, and it may take even longer because there is no strict deadlines. This is the first time it will happen. So these consultations will show the strategy for this process and how this interaction will look in the future between Great Britain and the EU. Mr. Grigoriev, do you have something to add? Well, I would like to add to what our British colleague has said. There were cases when Russia and Britain had different views, but in the most serious wars that concerned the whole European continent, we were allies. I'm talking about both Napoleonic wars, the First World War, and the Second World War. So there are historic prerequisites for closer ties between Great Britain and Russia. As for other opinions, I fully agree, actually. We'll have to see what happens in the future. So any other questions from the audience? A question from the first row, please. Culture, Sports and Society website. A question for Mr. Grigoriev, just continuing as a follow-up to your concerns ahead of the referendum and how it will be held. So I saw a map of the vote where certain manipulations took place and where they did not. Rural areas had actually won, and London showed 60% were for staying in the EU. Don't you think that your concerns materialize as regards the manipulations? Well, I've shared my perspective on the vote. We did have concerns of this kind, and we think that British laws have some loopholes that may seem strange for us in Russia. I was surprised that at the polling stations were not closed, so members of the election commission could see how people are voting. This surprised me. They did not have pens but pencils. So you could actually erase the mark on the ballot. But I do not think that there were massive, incidents where, the marks by voters were erased and changed to the other option. I think that since people who had permanent residence in Great Britain and a work permit while being citizens of the EU community, of the British community, of the Commonwealth actually, I'm talking about the Commonwealth, where only 2 countries are also members of the European community. This raised an issue for me. Why there is such a provision, but overall I think that even though the government thought, I don't know whether the government thought about using this option, but I do not think that the government had any manipulations, so I believe that the referendum was quite transparent. But still, I believe that there are loopholes in the British electoral law, because the less we have any possibilities for electoral violations, the better it is for the democracy. Well, just to add a couple of words, I've already mentioned that when I tried to predict the result of the referendum, I thought that more than 2.5 million British subjects are outside the countries and that they would vote for staying in the EU, but I looked at how can they vote, but in Paris or in Berlin or Spain, where a lot of British live, there was not a single polling station. They were offered either to go personally to London or to other part of Great Britain, or to send their ballot by mail, or to vote by proxy, which is a very complicated procedure, and they were offered to vote by mail. So these 2.5 million of British subjects who were in continental Europe were unable, most of them were unable to vote. And maybe this difference, we know that the difference between the yes and no was 1.3 million. Maybe these votes decided the outcome of the election. Maybe they did not want to vote and did not want to take part in the election. They did not want to spend money and to come to London. Maybe we should say that they did not want to vote. It's not that they could not vote. They had to register ahead of the referendum. They had to go to the election commission and to register and then to vote by mail. So the procedure was quite confusing. And just to add very briefly, I think in this respect, it's important to know that those who were for the Brexit were better organized and better motivated. They had this emotional drive to leave the EU, and probably they were better motivated than those who thought that they represent a majority that wants to stay in the EU. So the opponents, those who voted for the Brexit were better motivated. When you talked about the symbolic role of the Queen, our British colleagues did not agree with you. So I think that the 60% that voted for staying in the EU in London apart from the fact that the British Queen is a symbolic figure, she also has some leverage on the situation in terms of its security services or something else. So I think that there were some manipulations in London. Well, but I believe that the Queen of Britain, in terms of being an independent figure on political and economic issues, she has limited functions, and I would not suspect the British Queen of influencing the outcome of the referendum. So I think, and I reiterate, that the election was quite transparent and fair. Of course, if there is an emergency, for example, if Britain comes under an attack, a military threat, of course the British Queen can play a more active role. She can sidestep traditional democratic procedures in an emergency, only in emergency. But I think this could only be caused by, a situation of war. Just a couple of words, not about the British Queen, but I would like to share my impressions. I watched British TV through the night, and the first results came from Gibraltar. It's an overseas territory. 95%, can you imagine that? I think about 20,000 people voted there. This is a small territory, but 95% of people voted to stay in the EU, because for them it is hugely important, because they have a border with Spain, and this could lead to a collision. But as the results started to arrive from the British Islands, from Great Britain, there was more blue color on the electoral map. Scotland, as Marcus said, voted for staying in the EU, and Northern Ireland, but Wales and England against. And of course the vote in England decided the outcome of the referendum, but those who wanted Britain to stay, they hoped that the major industrial centers would contribute to the victory of the stay campaign, and but they lost in a number of areas. They lost the small cities, they lost rural areas. They did have some the stay campaign had some success in Liverpool, in London, in Manchester, but this was a huge mistake for Cameron. He focused on major cities, and he thought that people in the rural areas will follow the opinion in the major cities. But people living in small towns, in the rural areas, did not follow the opinion, but they actually had an opposing view, and they voted to leave the EU. Thank you so much, and we'll have the last question from the audience. Alexander Skvartsov, Большая Moskva newspaper. Question to Mr. Papadopoulos and to our Moscow experts, if they have something to say. There is a feeling that the Brexit was used by political forces in Britain to come to power, since they were not satisfied with the last elections in Great Britain. Do you agree or disagree with this point of view? And I can add to this question, do you agree with the statement by David Cameron that Britain bought a ticket, one-way ticket, whether in 10, 20 years that the exit will last, or whether they can change the opinion and whether they will want to come back within the EU? This is a question for Mr. Papadopoulos, first of all.
First of all, what we need to remember is that when David Cameron promised the referendum, he promised it believing that his Conservative Party wouldn't win the general election in May 2015. He believed that the Conservatives would fall from power, and that that there would be a Labour coalition government. So that says something about David Cameron's leadership skills. That shows something about his strategic thinking, that he promised something that he didn't think he'd have to deliver. But nonetheless, he did have to deliver on that. And of course, I think if we can put it in a very crude way, he put the rope around his own neck. For a lot of people in Britain, in particular English people, they're not really aware of the fact that if Britain was to leave the EU, it's going to leave the EU now, they're not aware of the fact that Britain just can't join again. A lot of British people believe that if it doesn't work out for an independent Britain, well, we can just rejoin the EU. But as Merkel has said, as Juncker has said, once you're out, you're out. Now, that is not a realisation at the moment for a lot of British people. Perhaps one day soon, that will become a brutal realisation. Can I just very, very quickly pick up on one point that both your guests in Moscow spoke about regarding where the different votes accumulated in Britain for Remain and Stay. Scotland, Northern Ireland, Liverpool, Manchester, other parts of Northern England overwhelmingly voted to stay in the EU. Now, why was that? Well, factually speaking, those areas of the EU are very, very poor. And if you go back to the 1980s, when you had Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister, she deliberately neglected those regions of the United Kingdom. Why? Because they're fiercely working class areas, they're fiercely Labour Party areas. So she, in effect, starved those areas of money. It was the European Union that stepped into that situation in the 80s and the 90s and provided money, economic programmes to those areas like Manchester, like Liverpool, like Glasgow, Aberdeen, for example. So many people in Scotland, in Liverpool, in Manchester and Northern Ireland will say this to you, that things are tough for us today in 2016, but our areas would have been a wasteland had Europe not have stepped in and helped us financially. Now that's something that isn't known by a lot of people in Britain, in particular amongst the English in the south of the country. And that's a failure on behalf of the British media. But then we can look at that from another way. Britain does not have a balanced media. Most of the newspapers are overwhelmingly Conservative Party supporting, are overwhelmingly right-wing. So it wasn't in their interests, in their ideological interests, to tell the people of Britain that Europe had actually prevented parts of the United Kingdom from becoming a wasteland. So that's the sad realisation about British politics, about British democracy. I know we've already touched on the role of the Queen. I don't believe, as your guest said, I don't believe the Queen interfered with the referendum, but the Queen is not powerless. Yes, officially we have a constitutional monarchy, but let's not forget that the British establishment is the ultimate power in Britain. And who is at the heart of the British establishment? It's the royal family. So we must never forget that. No, I don't believe the Queen interfered with the EU referendum. Yes, there's suspicion that she wanted Britain to leave the EU, but the Queen is not some innocent, harmless little old lady you see on a train or on a bus. She is the heart and soul of the British establishment.
Nikolai Борисович.
Mr. Topornin, do you have something to add? Just 2 words. Maybe this is a question to Marcus. Look what we have. The Conservative Party initiated this referendum, although part of Conservative MPs were against. The Prime Minister and most cabinet members wanted Britain to stay in the EU. The Labour Party, it has a new leader, and Jeremy Corbyn said that Labour Party supports the EU membership. And we know the Labour MP Joe Cox, who was killed. And apart from Nigel Farage and the UKIP party and some other radical leaders in Great Britain, all major parties supported the EU membership. How does it happen that people in Great Britain did not hear what 4/5 of the MPs were saying? They had elections 1 year ago, and now with the exit vote, against the background that the two major parties were for staying in Europe, does this mean that British citizens do not trust their parties?
A lot of voter apathy in Britain. There's a lot of distrust amongst ordinary British people of their politicians, and there's a lot of suspicion amongst their politicians. The expenses scandal, which erupted in 2009, has done tremendous damage to the reputation, to the integrity, and to the standing of Britain's politicians at Westminster, and quite rightly so. But of course, there's other factors involved. As I said, the referendum debate in Britain was not a serious one. It wasn't an intelligent one. It wasn't a mature one. This was an internal Conservative Party issue. This was bitter rivalries between leading Conservative Party politicians, which were being played out. And the Conservative Party has torn each other's throats out during this debate, as their party did in the 1990s when John Major was its leader and when John Major was the Prime Minister. And I think also we can talk about the English people, not the Scots, not the Northern Irish, perhaps the Welsh, but mainly the English people, and particularly the English people in the South. I've already made references to the English people in the South, and there's a reason for that. That is where you find a strong sense of Anglo-Saxon superiority, a strong sense of imperialism, a strong sense of nationalism, a strong sense of jingoism, of racism, of regarding Europe as being completely different to Britain. And that is reflected in the British media. As I said earlier on, Britain does not have a balanced media. And even though the Labour Party and at least half of the Conservative Party at Parliament, not all of them, but at least half, wanted Britain to stay in, that got completely overlooked because the atmosphere, the environment in Britain, in particular in England, has been for decades now quite anti-Europe, has been very suspicious of Europe. And of course, having a referendum wasn't going to change that. You know, you can't have a campaign for 3 or 4 months and change what's been going on in Britain for 20, 30 years. So it was always inevitable that the English people would vote for Britain to leave the EU. And of course, if you ask many English people, in particular in the South, who is Britain's true friend and ally in the world, it's the United States of America. And I believe that now Britain has left the EU, or will leave the EU, that the special relationship which is in existence between Washington and London will become even more pronounced now, possibly to the detriment of the British public.
Спасибо. И есть еще один вопрос, который я...
Thank you so much. I also have one question. I ask you for 5 more minutes of your time. And this is a question from International Life magazine. I have a question for everyone regarding Scotland. If most people in Scotland voted to stay in the EU, will it increase tensions between Scotland and England, and will it push Scotland to leave the United Kingdom? I've just read a statement by Nicola Sturgeon from the Scottish Party, and he said that given the result of the vote in Scotland, the question of independence from Great Britain becomes relevant once again. So it is possible that in some time, I think it takes at least 5 years under the law, Scotland will try to hold another referendum for independence. Marcus, do you have something to add on Scotland?
I don't think anyone at Westminster is doubting that Scotland isn't going to hold another independence referendum. As the guest said, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, who's in charge of the Scottish Government, has said that Scotland does not want to be outside the EU, and she's right, Scotland would suffer by being outside the EU, so they will bring about another independence referendum, and this time they will probably win it. Let's not forget 2 years ago, they only lost, the SNP in Scotland only lost that referendum by about 200,000 votes. And the role of the British mainstream media in that campaign was diabolical, in particular the BBC News, the amount of scaremongering it created. But 200,000 votes was not a lot to have lost. The stakes for Scotland's economic prosperity, for its overall well-being, is really at stake now. As I said, no one at Westminster or anyone else in the Union is doubting that there won't be another independence referendum in Scotland, and as I said, they will more than likely win. So Britain will reduce in size, and the British economy will reduce in size, because there's a very, very big industrial sector in Scotland, and you have North Sea oil and gas, and on the west coast of Scotland in recent years, vast reserves of oil has been found. Now, an independent Scotland would have that, would have the new reserves of oil, would have North Sea oil and gas, and would have a very large industrial sector under its belt. So the UK economy is going to become smaller in the future.
Thank you so much. We will end our video conference at that. Thank you so much to our experts for meeting with reporters, and thank you to our journalists for coming. Thank you.